So I think we can actually start now that we have Manu among us.
Yeah, sorry, I know that's more the Persian side of me than the German, so please bear with me. Yeah,
that is okay. So, but that's perfect, Manu. I think we will open the event with your coming then, and welcome to everybody to the Think Tank Talk, and thank you so much for joining. I hope you have your lunches ready, and feel free to eat during the event. It's part of the fun. So my name is Maria Isabel, and I am the head of the Think Tank Hub, and I'm very much looking forward to this event today that is called Playing Global Order, and the big question is, can video games reinforce good behaviors towards a better world? So that's a very big word, and I'm super happy to hear all your thoughts on it. Just a very quick introduction from my side on what the Think Tank Hub is. So the Think Tank Hub is an initiative by Voraus, the Think Tank Voraus, and a collaboration with the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs, which facilitates the involvement and evidence-based contribution of think tanks to policy discussions within the International Geneva. And Edu will tell you a bit more on who we have with us today. But without further ado, one important information is that the event will be recorded. So if you don't feel comfortable being recorded, just change your name and switch off the camera. But we encourage you to stay active and participate actively. And if you want last information, if you want to connect with people after the event, feel free to send us your email addresses or post them in the chat so that you can interact with each other. And with this, I'm happy to introduce to you Eduardo Belinchon that will moderate through our event today. He is a digital innovation manager at Voraus, at the think tank Voraus, and Edu, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria, and welcome everyone to this think tank talk. I think it's a very nice and interesting topic today. I'm just going to give you like very brief instructions about the talk today. First, regarding the structure, will be like a quick intro to the topic, now a presentation of the speakers, and then we'll have like a few questions that we'll ask the speakers. And then we'll discuss about it, but anyone in the audience, if you feel like contributing or asking a question, you can switch on your camera at that point. And on that regard, I will ask you now of the audience to turn off the camera and to use the feature of hiding no video participants. So in order to do that, you can go now to my square if you are in gallery view. And there are 3 dots there over my name. And then you can say hide non-video participants. So in this way, you will only see the panel speakers and now myself too. Yeah, maybe, yeah. Timothy, if you wanna switch off your camera. That would be great. Thank you very much. So now we are in this more like intimate mode. Just want to give you like a quick intro to the topic. I know many of you might be thinking, why is a think tank of foreign policy like Voraus talking about video games? It's kind of like a very far distant topic for us usually. But in reality, we think that there is a fine line that can connect these 2 worlds. Like many online multiplayer games are very powerful tools to connect different people, bring different audiences. Also, video games are a powerful tool for communication to reinforce certain narratives if we look at it. We think that the video game industry is changing, is shifting. Like we see, for example, recently Electronic Arts, they appointed the first female chief studio officer, Laura Miller. Also, they started including female teams in the FIFA game, like, trying to push a bit that gender narrative. But it's not only the industry, governments, international organizations like the ICRC, they are starting to approach the game industry or creating their own video games to support certain policies, certain narratives. And this is a bit the topic that we we want to hear from our panels today to discuss and hear what you do in this field. And with this, I would like to introduce you our speakers. So we have Elizabeth Newbury. She's the director for the Serious Game Initiative at the Wilson Center. We have Manouchehr Shamsrizi, sorry if that was not the right pronunciation, who's a fellow of the German Council of Foreign Relations. He does many other things. He also published recently co-authored a paper on video games and foreign policy that was a bit the inception of this think tank talk, because we were very impressed by the paper. And we also have Ewan Watson, who is head of cross media at ICRC. And with this, I would like to give you the floor, maybe our panel speakers, and if you would like to introduce yourself, maybe we can start with Elizabeth.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. Full disclosure, it's a little bit earlier here in DC, so please, some leniency as I let my coffee flow through me. So thank you again. My name is Elizabeth Newbury, and I'm the director of the Serious Games Initiative at the Wilson Center, which is a think tank focused on international policy here in Washington, D.C. in the United States. The Serious Games Initiative at the Wilson Center is a decade-old initiative that was founded under the principle of exploring the concept of serious games, which are games that are not used strictly for entertainment purposes. And I'm happy to break down what that exactly means later, but one of the things that we really try to emphasize here is that although games being used for educational purposes is nothing new, there was a general movement about a decade ago in the United States, particularly in the federal government level, to support the broader ecosystem of games being used for positive outcomes. At the Wilson Center, I fit a very specific niche as my games focus on public policy education. The Wilson Center is an international policy think tank, so we have regional studies and we also have global studies around different issues from environment to science and technology. And it was founded by Congress as a way to elevate public dialogue, and really our games are very much focused on trying to make very complex policy discourse that's happening within the DC bubble and making it accessible through interactive and fun platforms like games. In many ways, I'm a professional translator, taking very complex topics, such as very exciting things like disinformation, cybersecurity, the federal budget, or ocean plastics, things that my colleagues would normally put into a 25-page or longer policy brief, and trying to make them engaging in a nonpartisan educational tool. I'm happy to dive into this a little bit more. I don't want to hog the floor too long, but one of the questions I often get is, why games? Why should we use games for this sort of educational and outreach purposes? And one of the first things I often say is that games can often lower the barrier of entry. Some of the games that we've produced, for example, around the federal budget, our latest game is called Fiscal Ship, which you can play at fiscalship.org. We've had about 3 million people worldwide play our various budget games and engage with the topic of the federal budget policy, which is normally something that not that many people would want to engage with on their off time. And we take very much pride in trying to make those sort of policy discourse concepts accessible and motivate people to engage with them. And that's one of the reasons why we really gravitate towards games, is that motivation. The other reason why games can be really motivating is they keep people engaged. For example, we helped amplify a game with our Brazil Institute that was done in part with the Bravo Foundation in Brazil, that challenged students in the city of Sao Paulo to be mayor for a day. It's now part of their city's civic education curriculum, much like a textbook. And one of the things we found, that after playing the game, 67% of students who played the game said they were more interested in politics. 69% said they were more willing to monitor the government. And 67% said they were more confident in their ability to influence public policy after playing. So the two ways that we often see motivation in games is first engaging with the topic, period, because we've made it fun and engaging. And the second is motivation to continue engaging with the topic after they've actually played the game. So wanting to learn more and wanting to continue on after that. There's a number of different ways that we can engage with games, but I'll stop there. And I'm just very excited for this topic. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and super interesting. Just a quick question. Do you have a favorite game?
Do I have I get that all the time. So during the pandemic, my husband and I have been playing a lot of board games. And I actually really have gotten into this game called Wingspan, which is about birds, of all things. But it's a very fun game to play.
That's awesome. Thank you very much. Now, maybe Manouchehr, would you like to tell us about yourself and your work?
Yeah, happy to do so. Thanks for having me. As a footnote before I start, I hope the sound is nice. I made use of the just reopened coffee places policy of my hometown to make my first day of mobile office, and I hope it works for you guys. Yeah, and second note before we start, because we had that in the discussion leading to this, I checked. I should have played the fiscal game, I guess, because I found the reason why I used to be a member of Voraus and I'm not anymore. It's simply because new people tried to reach me many years ago, telling me that I should pay my members fee, which I somehow didn't, and never read those emails. So proud Voraus think tank alumni here. Okay, but that's the fun part, maybe just for the beginning. Yeah, so my background is in political philosophy of international relations. That's where I'm originated from. That's also, of course, Elizabeth, why I know the amazing work of the center, which I got in contact with when I was a Global Justice Fellow at Yale many years ago. In 2014, I became one of the co-founders of the Game Lab Berlin, which is part of Humboldt University's Cluster of Excellence. And if you take into consideration the scope of this research group, peak was about 30 people in more than a dozen disciplines, from psychology to computer science to international relations, was and is one of the leading places, so to say, for in the German-speaking part of the world for researching how the cultural techniques of gaming and the technologies behind gaming impact society. Yeah, I founded a social entrepreneurship, which turned out to be one of the first gaming studios able to develop a game that is recognized as a medical device and is paid for by health insurances in Germany. Those are games for people suffering from Alzheimer's. But as I said, my original background is in international relations, and then gaming came as an add-on, and I never thought that these two strings would ever meet. I always planned my life to have, you know, both as separate perspectives. And then the Foreign Affairs Ministry of Germany asked us to write a study, which I had the honor to head, on how they could use gaming during the German EU Council presidency. So that would be last year. And then the German Council reached out and asked if we could, if we don't want to have a fellowship specifically looking into that. I'm telling you this in detail, not because I'm a neurotic person, but because something interesting happened since we started to work on that study. And that's a shift in two directions, which would be two insights I can share. The one is we started while working for the Foreign Ministry with the nice aspects, let me put it this way: foreign cultural policy, educational policy, public policy, many of the huge potentials Elizabeth already introduced us to. But it was an interesting learning for me to see that you have to include the other part of the story, so to say, as well, to include everybody in the policy making and foreign policy community, by which I mean there's this study that has been famously discussed, at least in Berlin, when it came out, by the British Ministry of Defense, pointing out that now that games and the narrow AI that is used in many games, StarCraft 2 as an example, is publicly available and everybody can have access to this narrow AI via Steam in 20 minutes. Now the Ministry of Defense of UK argues that this will lead to a world in which offensive cyber capacity is much cheaper than most of the members of the foreign and security policy community believe. So we are still thinking in, if you want to start a cyber war, you need to be North Korea or Russia or whatever, and you need a big botnet and a hall full of hackers, so to say. But the circle of entities able to do so might just explode, because you can use the AI of StarCraft 2 to train your own cyber capacity. So we need to think beyond, that's my first point, the nice aspects which we all love, communication, intercultural exchange, and when you play esport, it's a team can have a physically disabled member from Johannesburg and an LGBTIQ member from Singapore and one migrant from Berlin. That's all true, but there's also the security policy aspects. China is collecting data via the games that people play. Tencent is strategically buying into gaming studios. We saw that in California when Blizzard Activision was got a bipartisan congressional initiative as a reaction to them banning a competitive gamer from Taiwan who dared to say free Hong Kong in a game, in an esport tournament, because Tencent, with only having 5% of stocks of Blizzard Activision, impacted the business so strongly that they were able to force Blizzard Activision to, technically send someone home who was a member of that community. So that's the one shift, to include all aspects of foreign policy. The second would be, if we want to fully understand how the impact of gaming as the most used cultural technique of our times is on foreign policy of any kind, we should also look beyond serious games. I love the approach that is called Games for Impact, because it includes analysis, the fact that even a game that never was designed to have a serious impact is having a serious impact. If you look at the big gaming titles, they all send a political message. And that is something to include. I have the feeling that is not done enough yet. And that's something we should put a much stronger emphasis on. To quote the historian from Austria who wrote on video games a few years ago, there is no game without a political message. Even Tetris has one. And if other countries are using that strategically in the how's it called, Wettbewerb der Narrative, in the discourse on who has the narratives, free open societies versus authoritarian societies, we need to check what messages are sent in these games as well.
Thank you very much, Manouchehr, for the introduction and the perspective to it. Now, do you have a favorite game, by the way?
Yes, I have. I'm also asked that question quite a lot, and for many years I wasn't able to answer because of my jury duties in the German Computer Game Award. We are asked not to answer this question, but I'm not in the jury anymore, so I can say it's Witcher 3, a game that has 36 different outcomes depending on the moral decisions you make. Is a pretty cool thing. I love it.
Very nice. Thanks for like, the perspective that you were talking about like how, to boost, like how, the games can push certain narratives in a negative way. Maybe we'll come back to that afterwards. But let's Iwan introduce himself and tell us about his work too.
Thanks, Edu, and hi everyone. Really good to be here with you. So my name is Ewan Watson, and I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross here in Geneva. This is my kitchen, just in case you were wondering whether I'm out of kind of lockdown. No, not so far. But it's really good to be with you. So the International Committee of the Red Cross, or ICRC, I don't know if you've heard of them, but it's probably one of the oldest humanitarian organizations or movement, where we've been around for over 150 years. And so it's not necessarily an easy leap between that and video games, but I'm going to try and make that link apparent to you now. The organization I work for is particularly focused on war and the consequences of warfare, and how wars are supposed to be fought, so the laws that govern them. So we often like to think of ourselves as an organization that is the first into a crisis situation, whether it's Syria, South Sudan, Afghanistan, and the last out, so that we are there after the guns stop firing. We're helping reconnect or find missing people as a result of the conflict. So we're there for the long term in these devastating war settings. And so my job within that, so as head of the cross media team, is to raise awareness ultimately about the consequences of warfare, and around some of the rules that are supposed to govern them. So if you've seen any of our content or campaigns around, for example, nuclear weapons and why it's so important to ban nuclear weapons. ICRC, by the way, was one of the first organizations on the ground after Hiroshima. Then that content is developed by my team. And we're also the team in the organization that sets out what's happening on the ground from our perspective in a place like Gaza today or Yemen, and talking about why it's so important to uphold the rules of war. So you can probably see where games fit in here. Our organization essentially promotes respect for the rules of war, and that in a nutshell means don't use torture, don't deliberately attack civilians, avoid killing prisoners or the wounded, don't attack hospitals or the medical personnel that work in them. And that is core business. So for me, I've been working over 10 years now in the ICRC. And I started in what we call the field, which is in humanitarian settings. So I worked in Colombia and then in South Sudan, Central African Republic. And really there, and in all the countries where we work, we're looking to promote the basic rules of war. And we do that in very different ways, from speaking to armed groups and armies in South Sudan in the bush, or speaking to media about a humanitarian situation and why it's so important for the laws to be respected. Or we try and find, over the years, innovative ways to pass that simple message of respect the law. One I would flag to you is a World Cup many years before, where at halftime during a football game, we organized like 5 minutes of a game of football without any rules at all. And of course, you can imagine that it was complete mayhem, right, with no rules at a football game. And that was kind of like a publicity stunt to say, well, football needs rules, and so does war. It's the same kind of basic, simple, humane thought process. So now, why did the ICRC get interested in video games? And I'm just going to give a couple of quick points and then leave it for discussion. So obviously, war games is kind of a natural habitat for us to be interested in, from all that I've explained about our focus on warfare and the consequences of it. Often video games, we see in them all the things that we don't really want to see on the battlefield, right? Impunity, indiscriminate killing, there's no limits, the ends justify the means. So like there a risk for us that war crimes can be in some way normalized, and the gamification of killing from a distance is something that we see in the real world, the manifestation of that through the use of drones in warfare, for example. So there is a risk there for us. Also, the research that we've conducted on how to influence arms carriers, how to influence militaries, arms groups, is that basically you have to adjust your educational and learning approach and use the cultural references that they will respond to. So in South Sudan, for example, they're very fond of wrestling through there. And there's a rule which is, well, you don't involve old people or kids in wrestling matches. And so we've tried to latch on to little cultural references like that in a place like South Sudan to explain the wider framework that we want to get across about the rules of war. Another reason why we're interested in it is because we see that the parallel between real life and war games is very much there. One of the 5 causes that we've outlined for why violations of the rules of war happen, well, 4 of those reasons are present in video games, like the encouragement towards committing crimes as part of the very nature of war, for example. And then maybe finally, and I'm gonna close here, it's the interactivity and the repetition that is important to us, because players make choices, right? It's not just passively sitting in front of a film, it's a choice that you're making. And that is an educational and learning opportunity. And essentially our premise is that just like on a real battlefield, games should include virtual consequences for people's actions and decisions, and that there should be rewards and punishments baked into that. So that's a bit about the why, and I can talk afterwards about how we involve ourselves with the video game industry. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ivan, for this comprehensive introduction and the connection. And yeah, I have to ask you the same question. Do you have a favorite game there?
Edu, I'm so sorry to disappoint everybody. I'm not a gamer. I'm into like Monopoly and running and sort of offline ways of de-stressing. So, but what I have to say is that I do represent in the organization many gamers, because like we've got people who are massively into video games and who interact with the industry all the time. So I'm hoping to genuinely represent them today, even though I'm not really a gamer. Cheers.
That's fine, totally.
You're all aware of the fact that Monopoly was one of the first public policy games, right? It's interesting to see. That's why I'm telling, because many people don't know, but it was originally invented by a Christian movement trying to make the point that if you allow ownership of real estate, you sooner or later will end up with the monopoly. So it was a criticism, and it's one of the, maybe one can say, I'm not an expert on that, but maybe it's one of the interesting capacities of capitalism to take such an approach and turn it into a very well-selling game itself. So yeah, but that's one of the beauties of Monopoly. I was just reminded of that.
And it's a very interesting point, because we can see like how we could introduce certain aspects of video games to reinforce certain behaviors and to send certain messages. And this kind of takes me to the first question, maybe a bit of a lame question I want to ask you. Before this, I just want to make a quick reminder to a few people who just joined the talk. We are using the hide on video participants feature on the Zoom. So if you go to the view of gallery, you can quickly click on my square now. There are 3 dots there, and then you can choose hide non-video participants, and you will only see people on the panel and me. And if you have any comments to make, or if you want to ask any questions to the panel, you can turn on your camera at any point, and then you can address them. So coming back to this point of like, some examples of types of video games that can be designed for pro-social good causes, like doing good. Like, I think there is an overarching question around: can video games be good for social causes, or do they lose value when they are marketing for good or for educational purposes? And are they fit for education? And maybe I would like to start with Elizabeth again. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so first, I think it's really good to sort of lay out the taxonomy of games that we're talking about here. So the term serious game, which I direct the Serious Games Initiative, actually came out of the Wilson Center around 2008, coined for digital purposes. The term serious game well predated that. But in Ben Sawyer's original document, he sort of outlined two primary ways that serious games can be conceived. So games that are being used for non-entertainment purposes. The one is ones that are designed for positive outcomes and doesn't have to be strictly education. It can be the motivation of certain behaviors. It can be shifting attitudes towards something. But it doesn't have to, it could be art is another one. I had a working group across the US federal government called the Federal Games Guild that we have many representatives from the National Endowment for Humanities and the National Endowment for Arts. So some of the game products they fund are more for cultural preservation or art sense. But there's this idea of games that are designed from the very get-go for those sorts of positive outcomes. Then there's a category of games that are commercial games, and this is the ones that I sort of grew up when I was going through K through 12, where the teacher sees what we're playing, right, and tries to incorporate them into the classroom. So these are like commercial games. I believe we heard the example of StarCraft and a couple of others, but one popular example is Minecraft in the United States blew up, and educators everywhere were quickly trying to capture that excitement from their students and modifying the commercial game or incorporating it as a text into the game. It's much like Shakespeare's Macbeth and Romeo and Juliet were not necessarily designed for educational purposes, but you can use them as a text in the classroom. We're seeing more and more also a third category, which is a hybrid between these two. So picking on Minecraft again, Microsoft saw that educators were using it for this purpose and created an education edition of Minecraft. So this is an edition of the game that is strictly for some sort of positive outcome. We've seen it with Minecraft. We've seen it with Assassin's Creed, where they've hired historians to allow you to go on little, what they call the discovery tours of historic sites. You've also seen it with online games like EVE Online, which incorporated a citizen science component of it. But that's also a growing movement in the serious games field. So those are kind of the three ways that you can see games being used for this. The other scale is sort of the medium. We've talked about board games because I'm a board game nerd as well as a digital computer gaming nerd. But there's war games, which in the United States at least means like tabletop exercises amongst our military. Board games, which are a similar tabletop experience, and then everything from digital games to virtual reality. There also is a small network of folks who are interested in live action role plays. So very similar to what you were saying, even of the soccer game, where it's sort of a live participatory event. So those are that. I just wanted to lay out the scale of the opportunities here within positive outcomes. And I'll stop there so that other people can dive in.
If I may, because I can perfectly build up on that, I think this is one of the key elements to have this kind of classification, because at least what I've experienced over the last years is the more entities are interested in gaming for good, gaming for impact, serious games, no matter how you want to call it, the more blurred this gets. If you only talk about gaming, and that includes Dungeons and Dragons the same way, which I'm a big fan of, just to complete the nerdism here. If it includes pen and paper role playing, as well as Candy Crush, as well as 700 million Cyberpunk 2077 production, then we're not getting anywhere, because everybody talks about the same word. It's simple. I always tell my students it's similar to sustainability. If sustainability means reducing your plastic waste when you get your daily coffee, the same way it means, you know, achieving 1.50 climate targets by changing whole industries, then the word might be too abstract to help us come to a conclusion. Just to make a little addition to what Elizabeth said, I still would again paraphrase, because I see it as one of the main things that we should focus on as well as a community. Paraphrase my point from the first round, and that is, every game has this political dimension. I'll raise you one example to discuss that. I don't know who of you guys played the Division 2, a game by Ubisoft that came out in 2019, and I'm just giving you bullet points to give you an understanding of why you might be interested in looking into this 100% commercial games as well. In the Division 2, you're part of a, so to say, revolution, right? You're targeting the capital in Washington, D.C., which you might, if I'm talking about a game coming out 2019, played by millions of American citizens, you might start to get an idea of where the impact might be when we see a storm on Capitol a few years later. And you're storming Capitol because there is a conspiracy in which the US government is trying to misuse a pandemic situation to enforce specific rule of law and specific actions on US citizens to take away their freedom. That is the storyline, the narrative of the game. Now, the interesting aspect here for me is, if such a storyline would have been published in a book, would have been published on Netflix in a series, would have been part of a big cinematic happening in Hollywood, it would have happened in an industry that already has developed mechanisms to discuss this. Now that it's happening in the gaming industry, all we got from Ubisoft, the publisher behind this game, was this game, and I'm quoting, does not have any political message to anybody playing it at all. Again, a pandemic situation misused by a government to take away rights and liberties of citizens, and 2 years later we see a storm on Capitol. And then this game is even built, they had to admit that, on a strategic scenario planning by the US federal government from 2001 on how a bioterroristic attack on the states could look like. So you have a gaming studio taking a official federal government scenario, turning it into a game which is interactive, empathy-based, all the things we just discussed, right? But we do not have a policy community taking into consideration. That is an additional dimension, I believe, to the serious games approaches Elizabeth has been talking about. And I can only urge, and that has been one of the suggestions in our study to the German Federal Ministry of Affairs. We can only urge governmental and non-governmental actors of foreign policy to come up with the capacity to monitor what is happening in the gaming world, so that we at some point reach the same level cinema has reached, book publishing has reached, because even somehow needs to know which game is sending which understanding of war, to stay with that example. I give you one last concept, and then that's it. I love to use the example of Skyrim. It's one of the most played games at all, and one of the most complex, both legally and more philosophical situations of international relations is the responsibility to protect, which even can explain much better in detail as I can. The question is, at which point does a situation allow and maybe even force a sovereign state to intervene in another sovereign state, breaking that sovereignty to support a moral and human rights situation, right? Everybody who has played Skyrim has to make that decision. It's a very interesting tool. You have millions of people for over a decade playing a game in which they have to decide: do they support a proto-fascistic imperium in intervening in a small sovereign state, or do they support the sovereign state in defending that intervention? But without the intervention, minorities will hugely suffer in the area of Skyrim. So this is an interesting approach. This is millions of people getting a feeling for what responsibility to protect, one of the most complex aspects of international law and war and humanitarian war and so on, has to offer. But nobody's talking to them about them. So nobody's there to say, okay, you have made this decision. It's the same way Germany has decided when it came to interventions in Libya in the UN Security Council, or it's the opposite of what Germany has done in the Security Council. Let's discuss what made you make that decision and what idea of how we should intervene or not in a human rights crisis situation during a war in a sovereign state we should take away from this. So that's why I'm saying we need to beyond only making our own games, only with a big quotation mark. It's a huge thing, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not against that. I'm just saying we also need the capacity. The Red Cross needs somehow to be empowered to know what messages are out there so they can talk to the gaming community, not in our events, right? It's preaching to the convinced. Many of these approaches we've seen so far is preaching to the convinced. You need to not only reach the people who are willing to download the serious game that the government has produced, you need to talk to the millions of players out there on Twitch, on Discord, in their community. That's where we need to be present to have the discussion, I believe. Also, it's cheaper than making your own game every second year. At least that's the case for the German government. They have not been very well in spending people's money on making successful games. But that's my personal opinion, and I hope it's Chatham House when it comes to this.
Edu, maybe I could jump in, follow up on what Elizabeth and Manu just said there. So maybe just to give you an example or two of how we've worked with video game companies and our experience to date, because we have tried to engage and with some degrees of success. So I guess it started about 10 years ago for us, and the main, I would say, area of success or most mature relationship has been with Bohemia Interactive around their Arma 3 game. So we started, as I said, about 10 years ago, and at that point for us it was kind of like, even internally, a bit taboo to be talking about video games or to video game companies. People were, even internally, people who were doing that were getting questions like, have you lost the plot? What are you doing? So it's really been an evolution internally as well for us. But that relationship that we've built culminated, and is still ongoing, but culminated in 2017 with some downloadable content for the Arma 3 military shooter game, which integrates some areas of international humanitarian law, right? So for example, there's a medical officer in that game that that can be your vector, and that cares for his comrades, and that kills enemies too by shocking them with his defibrillator. So we've tried there to introduce an element of like do good while also attempting to, you know, hold on to the fun that this game is fundamentally supposed to be. And there, the takeaways for us are that, firstly, you need to be looking at a long-term relationship with these companies. You can't just kind of breeze in as a humanitarian organization and expect you're going to change things in a quick amount of time. Secondly, what's really helped us is that we've had direct access to the CEO, because he is just interested in this. So we've had his ear and we're able to change, therefore, the gameplay mechanism. And it goes beyond just a kind of a piece of PR gimmickry for that company. It becomes more fundamental to their work. And the link is clear for us in terms of training. Like Arma 4, when it comes out, will be able to be used as a training tool with militaries, which Arma 3 is not at the moment. So we see the link there very clearly. What we've done, maybe just another quick example of how we've worked with video games, is with Fortnite. So obviously a very different game. What we did was we developed a play good mode, when essentially people got rewards for healing people and doing kind of very basic kind of humanitarian do-goodery as part of the game mode. And we launched that at one of the conferences. When was that? 2019, I think. And like people could, you know, we got a few well-known gamers to demo it on Twitch. So look, that's the way that we've done it. I wouldn't describe it as like, wow, what a breakthrough, but it's a slow series of achievements aiming towards the same thing. Over to you.
Can I add a very short point to what Evan just said, because I love this example and this approach. Two aspects. One is, I feel it's not only the industry, it's the community as well. You might want to talking to, because in many cases, many issues, also talking diversity in gaming and so on, community is far more progressive, so to say, or sensibilized than the industry is. And the second is, even said that earlier, having gamers in your own organization, those are the people you want to talk to first. That's my impression, because they know both the aims of your organization and the political field you're in and so on, and the culture. When we started to work with the German Foreign Ministry on gaming in public diplomacy, we told them we would like them to send out an email to everyone working in the ministry, because we want to talk to the gamers there. And we had a bunch of people telling us there are no gamers in the German Federal Foreign Ministry, right? These are all upcoming ambassadors, serious diplomats. They all have, things they work on, but they don't game. Turns out, as it couldn't have been differently, the most used cultural technique of our times is also used by people working in diplomacy. And those people are your first place, your own people, that's my point, are the first community, I guess, to talk to, before you talk to agencies, consultants, or whoever is out there billing people a lot of money to explain to them how gaming works. You might have those people in your own crew, and they know your mission quite well.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Manouchehr, and takes me a bit into the maybe next, or following this topic about like how video games are designed. Like, are they reflecting a behavior in the world, or do they respond to certain political, messaging? And you were mentioning this before about the Ubisoft game, and we've seen this in many like games that touches like certain areas of pandemics, the wars happening. And the question for me is like, as you say, like, should we like talk to the community, the ones that, the users, that they should be conscious and demand more like positive behaviors within video games, or should be like more interaction directly within the industry and between government and official institutions and the games? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think you need to do both. And to stick with the example of the Division 2, I don't believe if we would do empirical research in the gaming community that played that game and would ask them, do you think there's a political message or a political dimension to that game? I don't think the community would have said no. But the publisher said there is none because they didn't want to get into, you know, a debate which might be complicated for them. So I stick with my point. The community is more progressive than the industry is. So you should talk to both of them. Yeah, and that also includes esport and first-person drone racing and all the derivatives, so to say, all the children of gaming of many decades, which we should also take into consideration. I talked about Tencent already. So many governments are using games very strategically and not in the nice way Elizabeth was telling us about. You know, informing about. I think that's a cool project, right? 3 million people. Many of those, if they come from different countries, might now be more aware and informed about how fiscal policy in the US is than in their own state. I can imagine, right? But that's the nice thing, and that's what we're looking at first. But that's not how China and Russia and the Iranian Video Game Foundation and so on are using these tools. Yeah, and community can inform you quite well about what is happening there, and I guess they will do so before the publisher of those games would do. All publishers Tencent has a stake in so far as I know have been pretty clear in saying there's no influence, there's no soft power, to quote Joseph Ney on this, in gaming at all. That's embarrassing, to be honest. The book publisher wouldn't say that. Even the music label wouldn't say that. Yeah. And if these things would happen in sport, just to make a comparison, because even we're talking about sport, and we know that sport diplomacy is a huge thing. Imagine the Olympic Games telling an athlete that he or she cannot join, right? Because the games are going to take place in Beijing, and this athlete has been telling the world that Free Hong Kong is his position on this discussion, right? I'm always coming back to China because it's a nice case to discuss. It's because they do it pretty open. There are many more. Don't get me wrong. But if that would happen to an Olympic athlete, we would have an international debate about that. Now that when it happens to an esport athlete, quote unquote, it's not even noticed by many actors of classical diplomacy. It was a huge step that a bipartisan Congress letter was sent to Activision Blizzard when that happened. That was way more than I guess many of us expected to happen at all.
Definitely. I mean, I think it's very important to build more awareness about this and educate a bit more. Elizabeth, I wanted to ask you anyways, how do you engage with the different communities or, you know, the people that you work on while designing the games that you work with?
So when I'm thinking of the impact in games, one of the first things that I always think about is what is the learning goal? And from there, it also ties very closely with who am I talking to and where's their current state. So for example, we developed a game for a closed-door workshop on disinformation with congressional persons and MPs and that sort of thing. And one of the first things that we had to do was consider that audience. What is it that they currently know about disinformation? What is it that they need to know about disinformation? But also, where can we shift the dialogue and providing them with tools specifically into combating disinformation? So it's not a lot of disinformation games focus on awareness that disinformation exists. And we wanted to progress it a little bit further by giving them tools in order to scaffold how or learn how to negotiate with disinformation if they were encountering it in their day-to-day. As far as the question of when I'm thinking about those audiences, I always think about those sorts of things and build the game out from there. When you're thinking about the broader context of commercial-based games, there have been examples where the communities aren't as aptly engaged in educational outcomes or sort of positive behavioral outcomes. I think one of the differences, though, is that with commercial-based games, there's a very disparate and very wide audience. Oftentimes, what I'm considering when I'm thinking about esports, my dissertation was on esports, and one of the things that I'm focusing on is who's not in the room. There's a lot of research out there that illustrates there's a sort of perpetuated cycle of who's involved in the gaming industry, how games are designed, and they tend to be geared towards particular audiences that are not necessarily diverse. So when I'm thinking about audiences, I'm thinking about how can I make them inclusive spaces and how can I broaden that conversation. So just as a, for example, on esports, I'm hosting an event tomorrow. This is not a shameless plug. It just happens to fit in on historically Black colleges and universities in the United States and how they're orienting towards esports. And one of the conversations there is how do we make esports more inclusive and more diverse?
Please more shamelessly share a link.
I will
It's
shamelessly
fascinating.
share a link.
Thank you.
But so to answer it very quickly in a highbrow way, I'm thinking about not just who the current audiences are, but who could benefit from the conversations, and also how can I move the dial a little bit to make it more inclusive and accessible.
And I think that's going to be super important to touch a bit the point on Manouchehr, what he was mentioning before. If you make the audience more inclusive, more diverse, maybe things like what has happened, it will catch more attention. It will be more, visible for everyone.
But it says, as Elizabeth said, and I don't want to be misunderstood on that point, it has the potential of being like this. That's not the status quo we are often in.
I just want to make a quick reminder to the audience, if they want to make any questions or any comments, they're more than welcome to turn on the cameras. Also, they can post the questions on the chat if they feel shy today and don't want to show their faces. I'm sure our panelists will be very happy to engage. If not, anyone, maybe we can touch a bit about, since we are think tank hub is based in Geneva, something I wanted to, and most of our audience also comes from the Geneva ecosystem, international Geneva. I wanted to ask you, and I think you've been talking about this before already, but maybe, with like strong recommendation or message, like how the international Geneva, how international governments or organizations can engage more and better with the video game industry, the audiences. You want?
Yeah, I can jump in. Thanks, Edu. I mean, from the experience that we've had, I can think of a couple of kind of lessons learned that might be useful to get the conversation started. I mean, firstly, as I said before, it's kind of like a long-term relationship that you're looking to build with these companies. And Manu, as you kind of said it, being a gamer or having gamers in your organization that can engage and speak the language of the industry and the community is going to reap dividends, because it kind of underlines the fact that you don't have hidden agendas. And I think that's important as well, right? That you're just able to have a kind of an honest dialogue and speak the language. From our perspective, what we found has worked well is what I said a little bit before about Bohemia Interactive, the fact that we've been able to build a good relationship at a senior level of that organization, that there's really buy-in for integrating some elements of the laws of war into their Arma 3 and other games, right? That reaps dividends ultimately too. look for small wins. Don't imagine that you're going to change everything. It's about, if we're able to persuade a gaming company to just modify even a trailer, which they invest so much money in, in the promotion of their games in a way that might just have a slight reflection of the fact that there are certain rules to be followed in war in some way, is important, because that then leaves maybe a subtle but indelible mark on gamers ultimately. And of course, there is a money aspect here, in the sense that maybe organizations are also looking to the gaming industry as a source of potential income and partnership. Our feeling on that is, don't focus on the money first, at least. What's important is finding a concept that you can join forces on, build an understanding of what the substance of that partnership is going to be in terms of integrating rules of war somehow into the game, and don't focus on money first. Those would be just some initial pointers. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Iwan, for this last comments. I think we have to wrap it up here. We ran out of time. When there was a very interesting conversation, I think it was a very good learning experience. We just lost Manouchehr camera, but I hope he's still with us. Yes, I think there has been many good points touched upon the discussion around, engage, monitor the space for governments and foreign relations practitioners, what's happening there, raise a bit of more awareness of how political and video games are interconnected or influencing each other's, and also how to engage with practices like the ICRC, but also Elizabeth was explaining us, how to engage also with the community, trying to build more inclusion and awareness on the video games industry. For the participants, this think tank has been recorded. We will send an email to everyone with the notes, main conclusions of this conversation, and the link to the recording. Just keep watching the space for more interesting talks around foreign policy and social good. Thank you very much to the panelists. It's been a pleasure having you. I hope we will keep in touch and have another opportunities to keep on discussing about this topic.